Okay, so I really and truly am one of the most shocked people that I should be talking to about this. I, um, I worked for a long time in community media in Laurent, Saskatchewan. I ran the first actual native language television station very early on. And I worked with incredibly competent, organized, free people. And every once in a while, I would express an opinion, and that first thing they would say is, "Speak for yourself, white man." So I learned early that there were Indigenous people around who were articulate and organized and could say what they wanted to say, and I didn't need to step up for anybody. And so I worked for CBC for many, many years, and I did everything, and but I had that experience. 11 years I worked with the community TV, and I, learned to edit it, the Cree. I didn't speak it; it's their thing, but I certainly could edit Cree, and I could hear the words, and I knew roughly what the stories were about. And we definitely aired some stories about Wendigo, and there were, there was a sort of a convention about what they look like, and the Wendigo is a cannibal being. The Wendigo is the outcome of a very unhappy person, or a person who is starving, a person who suffered some terrible thing in life and has succumbed to the fear of it or the terror of it. And it is, whereas Europeans have a kind of ambivalent attitude toward people who would be in such an extreme position they would have to eat human flesh. For the Cree people who live in the sort of subarctic, Arctic, where starvation is a kind of annual fear, an annual genuine risk, they have a hard line: no eating people. If you eat humans, you cease to be human yourself, and you have to be killed. And so I learned those stories when I was doing community TV. And then, as I say, I went on to work for CBC for a long time, and I moved from Laurent after 11 years to Ottawa, and then to Winnipeg, and I was working for CBC in Winnipeg. And one of the producers said to me, I know you had something to do with First Nations people, and you have friends who are Indigenous, so could you do a radio show that explained why Europeans and Indigenous people don't look at each other when they pass one another on the streets of Winnipeg? What is going on? And so I did a show about stereotypes about Native people. In those days, I was Indians, so stereotypes about Indians. It was all those movie Indians, all that stuff that pops to mind when people recognize an Indigenous person. And it was 2 hours. One was all the bad things about First Nations people and how they are transposed onto the present, and how bad that is for our relationships. And then all the good stereotypes, the Pocahontas and the spiritual Indian and all that, and how bad they are because they set up an impossible cultural standard for Indigenous people, and then non-Indigenous people get to judge the people they meet against this impossibly high standard and judge them to be failing at their own culture, failing at their own being. And this is partly created by the sort of notion of Indigenous people as being culturally whole in the past. And if they survive colonialism, which nobody's allowed to do, they arrive at the present damaged and full of issues. And that trajectory doesn't match most Indigenous people's lives. They're perfectly happy in the present, and they're not damaged, and they are as Indigenous as they ever were. But so that was what that whole show was about. It was about getting rid of those stereotypes and meeting Indigenous people on their own ground and without the things that movies bring to mind. And so then after I did that show, it was a very successful show. This producer said to me, "Well, if you're so smart, how can you make a show with no stereotype in it?" And I made a radio show about a drum. The drum was real, and I had a photograph of it. And the show was 2 hours long, trying to find the drum where where it was, and it was still around 65 years later. And then the second hour was following the story of the drum back to the people who originally made it. And in the end, I found people who sang the songs and who remembered the dream that brought that drum about. And I found the communities of Pungassi, and I've been making radio shows on Pungassi ever since. And those people there didn't speak any English at all, so I was recording in Ojibwe, working in Ojibwe, and again, the Wendigo stories came up all the time. And so then I had a wonderful winter one year. A Cree fellow from Pewanak, Ontario, came to town. He was brought in on some historical university project anyway. That didn't work out too well, but he found me. And he said he had a whole lot of tapes to translate. He had recorded them. They were in Cree, and he was the only one who could understand them because they were very old language. And so I recorded him translating those old Cree tapes. And I'd pick him up every morning, and we'd go have coffee, and then he'd come to my house, and we'd sit down with all these tapes, and he'd work away at them. So I have hours and hours of him translating these fantastic old tapes. And while we were doing that, we talked about all kinds of things. And of course, Wendigo came up. And so he went back home again. And then one day he phoned me and he said, Pewanak's in the paper. He said that there was a sighting of a Wendigo, and newspaper people were here. And he said that it was a very large foot. And the local conservation officer had actually made a plaster cast of it. It was so big. And he said, but that didn't convince us. It was the terrible smell. They smell awful. And so he said, there was a stick lying beside this footprint, and the sticks just smelled horrible. The minute this old lady smelled it, she said, oh, that's what they are. So, and he said, but these people are going crazy. They're calling them Bigfoot, and they're all excited, and they all want to come in and see them. He said to me, don't they know that it's not good luck? It's bad to see a Wendigo or a Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. It's bad. It's not good luck. And so the radio show that I made with Louis came from that conversation. He wrote me a 3-page letter, kind of taxonomy of Wendigo, all the different kinds and all of the things that they mean. And then I went and I recorded his stories for a whole week and edited them for months after that. And so that radio show that I hope some of you have heard, it is the combination of Louis wanting to set non-Indigenous people straight about the idea of Bigfoot. And so here I am to talk about it. And I hope that some of you have heard it and that at least the transcript got around to everybody. And so with that, I would totally welcome questions. Maybe that would be the best place to start, just to find out where you're all at.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. And yeah, I mean, I'd love to start with some questions of my own if, you guys wouldn't mind me going first. But yeah, so I think probably the first question I'd want to ask you is, I've listened to the tape, and I've also done a lot of reading, before and after, kind of preparing for this meeting about Wendigo. And, in some accounts, it's not necessarily described as like a Sasquatch type being. What about, your research with Wendigo has, I guess, made you associate that with, Sasquatch encounters and footprints that I think, like you mentioned a few moments ago. What kind of makes you think the two are linked necessarily?
Well, I think that they come from the same body of stories, that they come from Indigenous stories, and then people murder on them. But the Wendigo is absolutely a stable part of Indigenous storytelling. And like I mentioned in the documentary, there's two kinds of Wendigo. There's the kind of naturally occurring ones I suppose those are the ones that you might refer to as Sasquatch. And they're kind of fleeting and they're shy and and as Louis explained, there's the spring ones and then there's ones in the fall. And by and large, they mean no harm to anyone. They're kind of voyeurish and they follow women. So the story that he told about the two women who saw this, and they're the ones who are 9 feet tall and hairy all over. These women saw this Sasquatch and saw that it was following them. They were paddling like mad across the lake and trying to get across the portages before this creature came crashing through the bush after them. But he was only wanting to peek at them. Like he didn't want to hurt them in any way. Those kinds of Wendigo are benign, and they're kind of a part of a semi-human, semi-spiritual entity. So there's two main sort of half and half entities, half human, half spiritual. There's the Wendigo, which has gotten famous through Bigfoot, and then there's the Mimigwesiwak, who are equally prevalent and are not famous. And I did do a radio show about them too, really pointing out that there isn't even an English word for it, like some people call them the Little Rock people, but I don't think that would mean much to anybody. But they are equally important and they have equally the same sort of presence in the real world. So Anishinaabe and Cree, all sort of Northern Canadian people, think of the world as having, it's kind of like quantum physics, you know, the sort of multi-world thing, two worlds running along at the same time in parallel, sharing the same geography. So the stories that happen with Wendigo that Louis tells, they all happen someplace. It's a place you can go. And you can go there either in the real time and see no Wendigo at all, or you can go in your dreams and see them. But the Wendigo have the capacity to cross from one world to the other. And so when people say, oh, the Wendigo footsteps were there and then they disappeared, well, that's where they went, the other world. That's the world where the spirit entities are. No Indigenous person thinks they're going to see those spirit entities in everyday life. But there are times when, like a good medicine man will cross back and forth. That's one of the skills they have, to visit those spirit entities and to communicate with them. The spirit entities themselves can cross over that line. But the Mimigwesiwak and the Wendigo are the two entities in stories that regularly move from one side to the other. They are there only on purpose. If you see them, they intended that. If they can disappear like that. And so Louis said, you know, the footsteps disappeared. He's saying, like, we're hunters. If there were more footsteps, we could have found them. They went there. And they just crossed over that line into that other world. So there's demarcation lines between that other world. Like there's quite a few stories where a person will go under the water and visit entities. It looks like they're on top of the land and their teepees and everything, but actually they've crossed the surface of a lake. Can be a barrier between that world and this. Thunderbirds are a very famous spirit entity that is more present than others, but it is always wrapped in cloud. The only time you see a thunderbird as a bird is in a dream or when the thunderbird intends. And so when Anishinaabe and Cree people talk about thunderbirds crossing the sky, they're talking about the clouds, but they say they're walking by. And they're talking about a cloud that is in the sky floating. It's because they're not referencing the mist that surrounds that cloud, that is the boundary of its world. They're referencing the bird inside. So if you have that understanding of there being a place you can go, you can't get there from here, if you understand what I mean, then those Wendigo have that power to cross back and forth and to disappear and to appear and so the thing that Louis said is that to see one is often kind of a bad omen, and you would worry about that. But spring ones, less so than the fall ones. And he did give a story about an old man who saw one once. He thought it was a bear. He went to have a good look and he realized it was actually a Wendigo. And he died a couple of years later in a very bad flood at Winnisk, the town which was scraped away by an ice jam, actually. And Louis said, well, that was a premonition of an early demise. And that's sort of like he really wanted people to realize that you shouldn't be wanting to see a week to go because it's not good luck. Then there's also the kind of Wichko that you can become if, as a human, you succumb to either great anger, great fear, or hunger. And so one of the stories that's in that documentary is about an old lady that Louis knew very well, who almost became a Wichiko. And the story was that she had a husband who was abusive. And finally, she was angry and afraid, and she couldn't take it anymore. And so she did what, like a really classic, transitioning from a human to a Wichiko. She came out of her teepee and she began to run. And she ran so fast her clothes started to fall off of her. And she started running like 2 steps on the ground, 1 in the air, 2 steps in the ground, and she was gradually taking off. And Louis' grandmother, as Louis says in the documentary, forgot her rheumatism or her arthritis or whatever, and ran after that woman and touched her as she was running by. And that woman collapsed like a bag of old clothes, just fell to the ground. And they saved her. They didn't let go of her for a week. They held onto her and they comforted her and they calmed her down and they soothed her and they combed her hair and they brought her back from the brink of becoming a Wichiko. And she told the story about herself, that she almost became a Wichiko. And so people can be saved and people try to save them. If you consume human flesh and they're found within hours, they can make it throw up and you can possibly be saved. But if she had gotten away, or if a person did eat human flesh, the transition is to something that is it is a danger to everyone. That woman would not have come back and gone after her husband. In fact, there's no story about him ever accepting any consequences for this. The risk is that she lost emotional control. And in doing so, she presented a danger to the entire community. And if she had come back as a Wichiko, she would have come back as a threat to anybody. Not to husband particularly, not even especially, but she would have started to be a risk to every other human she encountered. And so that's the other kind of Wichiko, is the one that you can become by giving into really powerful emotion.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, I've, in my degree and everything, like being in, the Canadian studies part of it, I've read like a lot of Indigenous literature and stories and things over the years, and it's really fascinating. And I've even, traveled to places before where, one time I was down in like Costa Rica and I was talking to someone there and he was telling me about, essentially Witikos down there. And, he said like, most people will never, would take it, no tourists would come down and take this type of thing seriously or think we actually have this type of stuff going on in our villages, but it's real, and I've like seen it with my own eyes, he told me. And it was really interesting. And I think with this type of research, it's a really important thing to look at, like the Indigenous side of it, with because they have stories going back hundreds and hundreds of years, and they're all very, very fascinating. And I even in my degree, I've read other stories with I was reading one thing with like they had stories of Norse like settlement in certain parts of the Arctic where they didn't think they'd been before, and they thought, oh, it's just a story. But then later they found archaeological proof and things. So I think these stories deserve a lot of respect and, really need to be taken more seriously and looked at as like very important history for us to be studying. So, oh yeah, and with that, my next question probably went on talking a bit too much there, but we're here to hear you. But yeah, so I was wondering, I'm really into history myself, and historically over the centuries, how far back do these Witigo stories go, and what are some of the more really unique, compelling historical tales um, that have stood out to you in your time learning about all this?
Well, the thing that was interesting about Louis's stories were that he knew the person to whom the thing happened. So those were all firsthand accounts of Witigo. That's what he was presenting. And quite often when you ask about these kinds of things, that's what you get, is here's what I know. And partly that is modesty on the part of the storyteller, and partly that is just kind of a limitation of oral histories. That people have a set of stories that they tell. And if they want you to know that they are telling the authentic version, they invite somebody else to be there while they're telling it. And it's basically like, this person will tell you if I'm telling a lie. So that's the way that stories as thematic kind of narratives are passed down through generations. And there is no question that those stories are passed down with a great deal of accuracy because of the idea of having somebody listen who verifies. Those legendary stories, sometimes the person's name is lost, but the story is told over and over and over again. Sometimes those stories are kind of aggregated under a kind of culture hero, like for instance, Wisakitsak. There's loads of stories about Wisakitsak, and those are stories that might once have really happened to somebody, but most of the time they're a story that's an explanation of the natural world, like all the Wisakitsak stories are after humans are invented by there are stories that come before it's called the Bear Pact. So there are giant animals that interact like humans, and all of the spirit entities like the Thunderbirds and the giant skunk and the bears and so on, those were all there, and they interacted with one another, and they decided that the world needed humanity, and they decided that they would offer the physical manifestations of themselves for the humans to eat. So the bear spirit offers bears to humans to eat, and their presence in your life is an act of the bear spirit. So it explains why you encounter a caribou when you need one, that kind of thing. So that, and then there's a kind of a trajectory to all sort of faiths. So the Christian faith started with perfect Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve sin, things are going badly. The trajectory is toward Armageddon, after which the virtuous souls will rise. But there's an assumption about things getting worse and worse and worse, and then never getting back to that perfection. Well, the trajectory of Anishinaabe and Cree stories is entirely the opposite. There's no origin myth. There's many different stories about the world. They all begin with some degree of chaos, but the world is always there already. There's the story of the flood, which is quite famous, but it's just another story of things going badly. And then Wisakitsak intervenes and creates the continent of North America by getting the dirt up from the bottom of the flood. And so the Wisakitsak stories explain a moment when things became more ordered. And with every story, things become more ordered. The loon gets its necklace. The bears are found to have a particular characteristic that's discovered. So that the stories are a way of learning that if you follow the protocols and if you respect these rules and if you understand these relationships, the world will be a safe place for you. So all of the knowledge of humanity, and a lot of it is gathered in Wisakitsak stories, which are somewhat apocryphal. They are lessons about life. And so this is also true about the stories about Witigo, in the sense that, and that the Wichiko stories are about social rules and what to do if people become too emotionally overwrought. How do you handle that? And it may be, I suppose, possibly their understanding of mental illness to some degree, but the method of dealing with it is very similar to what we would do, in therapy. It's just to be human and to be forgiving. And but the Wichiko stories are not like those old stories about Misaki-tak. They're more specific and more recent, and tend to be about somebody and they're like, don't do that, don't try that at home, and don't do that, don't be like that, don't. I guess you could kind of, like Louis and I talked about this a lot, but anyway, he said they're sort of stoic, that you really, what those stories say is that you can't do much about the bad thing that happens to you, but you can control your reaction. You must control your reaction. And it's not in the tape, but we talked about it afterwards. But Louis was in residential school for 4 years, and I asked him if there was things he wished he could forget, and he said, yeah, he'd seen some bigger kids beating up on little kids, and one child died in that, and so on. But he said, when I came home, my parents didn't want to hear too much about that. They certainly wouldn't have encouraged me to tell what had happened to me, because they would be afraid of me becoming emotionally overwrought, of falling into a state of lack of control of my emotions. They would have done everything to help me put it away. And which is interesting, because there's a lot of talk in non-Indigenous circles about, closure, and how if you speak about things, it'll be better, and so on. And I don't really know. I hope one of you is a psychiatrist and you can help me there. But to some degree, people do find a way to put things away. And the way that the Cree and the Ojibwe did was that they just reckoned it was too dangerous to go there. And there, within that tape, there's a story about a guy who became very afraid of something. And they found him out in the bush. He was just a wreck, and his hair was everywhere. And he just had to be re-socialized. That's the thing, is that the treatment is to be re-socialized, to be brought back into the group, and to retain your composure and regain the sort of capacity to love and a lot of here's another thing about that. European understandings. We talk a lot about self-image, self-control, self-whatever. You can't say that in Ojibwe and in Cree. It's just, there is no word for that. And now they could make up a word for anything, I grant you. But that idea isn't really there. A person's status in the community is related to the good they do in the world. So if you want to be well thought of, for goodness sakes, carry water for old ladies, make sure they have lots of wood, help out old people and children, and be seen to be kind, and you will have a reputation. Your image will be created, not in yourself, but in the eyes of others. So that's a kind of a basic idea in the community. So you're attempting to bring people back into that shared world where helping is being, where it's like as I've worked across languages for most of my working life, and there's the odd moment when the light bulb goes, how could I miss that? But there's a very important moment when I finally realized that there's no such thing as luck. if you are an Ojibwe person. An Ojibwe person and I could be playing bingo. I am just playing a game, you know, having a good time. The person beside me is testing their power in the world. They want to know whether they today could, you know, achieve something they might not have been able to achieve another day, or that they still have whatever they thought they had. And it's a world in which most things that happen are preordained, and a number of children you'll have, you know, all of that sort of thing. So if somebody can intervene on your behalf and extend your life, that's what medicine men do. They have extra life to give. They can help you last longer, or overcome something that was fated for you, or they can prevent somebody else very powerful from tinkering with your life. Because one of the principal values of an Indigenous or Cree life is to have to be living the right life, to be living your own life, to have a sense of autonomy and no interference from anyone else. So those values are all behind the Need to Go stories, and it's like that. So I'm sure, Ryan, that you would understand this. You know, people don't dream alone. They think they do, but everybody's dreaming a socially constructed dream. So we, in our imagination, we go together to whatever that place is. And, you know, for the longest time, people were seeing men from Mars and spacemen. And I suppose some people still do, but it's not nearly as prevalent as it used to be. Those are sort of things I'm talking about, like the sort of socially constructed imaginaries. And so for what you're talking about, you're delving into the socially constructed imaginaries of people who think very differently about the world, a lot more differently than you'd think by looking at them.
Yeah, I thought I'd just ask the club quickly if, you know, they had any questions they wanted me to ask you, and I obviously have a bunch more, but yeah, so maybe while we're waiting for the rest of the club to type their questions, I thought I'd ask, you know, with the history of, you know, Wittigo, right? Like, I was doing some reading earlier today, and I read the first, you know, European account was, I think, like a Jesuit in the 17th century in Quebec that wrote back to Paris talking about it. And obviously that's the first European account, but, you know, what I want to know is with Indigenous accounts, like how far back, like in history, time-wise, like when was maybe the very first account or furthest back that you ever heard of where you know, Indigenous culture said, oh, this instance happened with a Wittigo however many hundreds or thousands of years ago, and like, you know, what's the farthest back tale you've heard?
Well, they aren't dated, unfortunately. But one of the ways you can think about that is how widely distributed are those ideas? Because we know that people came here for 20,000 years ago. And if there are stories of similar kinds of entities, you know, all the way up and down South America and North America, chances are they brought that idea with them. You know, now I don't know that for a fact that there's Wittigo ideas in South America, but there wouldn't have been like a first moment of that idea that anybody could lay a finger on, any more than there would be if you asked, you know, the people of the book who thought up God. There's, you know, we know when the books were written, but we don't know when the story started. And, you know, as an anthropologist or as a studier of culture, you will know that people have two kinds of ways of thinking about the world. And these ideas not not always, but often enough, conflict. And one is a belief system around the world as it is. And Indigenous people could not survive if their belief system didn't match, where the deer go, what the rabbits do, like they Indigenous people have a phenomenal understanding of the natural world, which is framed by the beliefs I'm talking about. They also have a kind of social structure that worked extremely well for them, that matches human behavior to a significant degree, enough that they were doing fine before Europeans got here. And just because we worked out a different system doesn't mean that ours is better. With few exceptions, it is worse for the world. But so there's that science side. Everybody has a science side. That actually is like, how does the world work? Okay, I learned that today. That kind of thing goes on everywhere. But then there's the system of beliefs. It's not about what's happening, but about why me. You can, and this happens to us too. We can understand perfectly well the whole, exactly how it works when you get a rhinovirus and how it gives you a head cold and all. But why me? Why now? That's where faith comes in. And Europeans and Indigenous people have a whole structure around dealing with the concept of why me and how luck or fate works. And that is where we radically diverge. But that's what it's about. It's like if you think about boiling an egg. Yeah, when you think about boiling an egg, the hot water solidifies the albumin, and but the whole idea of the egg in the egg cup with the butter, and like, how did that come about? That's the faith side of things. That's the whole social structure around it. So I think that, I hope that that's sort of answering your question. There is so Louis would say there's a science side to the Wichiko. And the evidence that a Wichiko has been there involves the footprints, the sightings, if you see one, and the smell. And so in Louis' community, when that Wichiko footprint was spotted, the piece of evidence that really convinced everybody else was a guy was riding his four-wheeler to the airport. And this sighting was along this road to the airport. And the guy was just riding along, and a stick hit him on the shoulder and fell down to the road. And he rode on to the airport. He drove home. He told his mother-in-law. She said, go back and get the stick. He did. The stick smelled horrible. And she said, see, a week ago. So there is a science side to it. But there's then the whole understanding of why they wouldn't still be there. All of that. That's the other part. And it's turning out that the multi-worlds idea is probably what's happening to us really too. The quantum physics explanation of why there's many worlds in one, that the Ojibwe explanation of it is similar to that.
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, that answers it. And nextly, I was wondering, we've kind of talked about, history of it, what is a Witigo, all that. But I think a good area, not just for me to hear about, but the rest of the club would be what consequences have you heard about in terms of people, seeing one? Because I think you mentioned what you said a few years later, someone died, and I think when we were emailing you said that you've heard tales, I guess, of 1 year later people dying after seeing a Witigo. So I was wondering what typically happens to someone who has seen one.
Well, it's just a combination of a belief and an event. And so what Louis said was that guy did see a Witigo, and he was one of two people who died in the event where the community was scraped by this giant ice flow on the river, an ice dam that broke right over their community. And his explanation was that that fellow did see that Wendigo. That proves that is true. I don't even think Louis would say that was for sure going to happen to him, or that it was inevitable, but it did, and people say these things happen. I'm sure you can think of other instances where people say things like that, and they only remember the times that it does prove to be true, mostly. But I guess I don't know of any. I just know of that one instance that Louis gave us about that. The other thing is that although the Wendigo is known throughout the Ojibwe, really the Algonquian-speaking world, so that is the for sure that Cree speak a language that is similar to Ojibwe. You know how language families, like we speak a Romance language, family language. So it's English, French, Spanish, Italian, all of those are based on Roman languages, and they're called Romance languages. And Spanish and French have many similarities, and Italian the same thing. Once you figured out those languages, you can kind of work from one to the other. The same thing is true of Cree and Anishinaabe, Blackfoot, and Apache, but basically all across northern Canada, the Cree go into the Innu. That's another form of Cree. The people who lived in Newfoundland spoke an Algonquian language. These are all Algonquian languages, all the way down to the Powhatan. Pocahontas spoke an Algonquian language, and within that, there is this. This is a very prevalent idea, and so I guess that's the thing, is that the language makes it easy to talk about these things in this way. Does that help at all?
Yeah, no, definitely. We have another question in the chat. I don't know if you saw earlier, but yeah, Beck asked, Dr. Matthews, you've mentioned that Wendigo is notably odorous. Are there any indications to note?
You mean other proof? That's what everybody says, that they really are stinky, really, really stinky. And there's a fellow named Rob Brightman who's written some articles about Wendigo and Mimikwesawak as well, because they're the same kind of entity in the stories. And he says that in his experience, that people use Wendigo as a kind of a reference in all of the stories. The Wendigo were here first, and the Mimikwesawak were here first. So the Wendigo are kind of to the Cree and Ojibwe like the Neanderthals are to us. Hopelessly primitive. We wouldn't want to be like that. Kind of, kind of a reference from the past. And the Mimikwesawak are around still. The Mimikwesawak are kind of Luddites. They like the old ways. They don't approve of motorboat noises and that kind of thing. And they're used to critique modernity. So the Mimikwesawak are these kind of purists, and the Wendigo are kind of stupid and not technologically advanced compared to the people. So so when you ask, are there stories about the Wendigo? And now I think of it, the Wendigo came first. They were there before people. So of course their stories started with humans. At least, if you follow the logic of the stories as they're told. So the smelliness is just one of the characteristics. I encourage you to find Rob Brightman's articles, which I'm really happy to send to you, because it is so interesting. He did field work sort of between the two places that I have come to know, and it's just the same. It's the stories are told, like I was saying about the geography mattering, like the shared geography. But so, for instance, there are stories about Misakitsak, including one where he rolls a rock from one side of the river to the other. And in northern Saskatchewan, that happens at Nastoyak Falls. It happens at a particular place where Rob Brightman did his field work in the Puketawagan area. And there is a particular river near Pangasi where that story happens. And Louis had another place for it. The same story is told all over the place, but it is always happening at a particular place. And it's the way that those people who are telling that story use the story to make a claim to a particular piece of land or a particular area. Their stories happen there, and the story has a way of keeping the place important, and the place has a way of keeping the story important. People travel and they pass certain places, they tell the story of Misaki here or there, or they tell the story of the Wichiko or whatever. The places that they move through are kind of like their mnemonic for the stories. And there are even stories where you just mention the place and the moral lesson is clear and you're being scolded for something.
Yeah, no, thanks. And you know, I was kind of wondering, I don't know if this would be kind of an unoriginal question or something you get a lot, but you know, you told us kind of one Whitico story in depth there, but you know, I was kind of wondering if you had maybe a really, you know, I guess crazy sort of, you know, Whitico, like, you know, goes into a village and does this and this. I was just wondering, you know, what's kind of the most havoc, you know, I guess what's kind of a story you've heard where maybe a Whitico has done the most damage, or the, you know, had a tough effect on a community or something like that that you've heard.
Okay, well, when Ojibwe people amuse themselves, they have a story about, no, the Ojibwe tell the story with a woman heroine. Her name is Geshishwash, and Geshishwash means a little bit. And Geshishwash is incredibly brave and smart. And she is helping the Ojibwe at a time when the Wichiko have gotten totally out of control and they're living in families. And they call this particular kind of Wichiko the hairy hearts, because these Wichiko are really hard to kill. They take their hearts out of their bodies and their hearts are kept in a little down nest, eating away, someplace safe. And then the Wichiko goes about its life. And if you happen upon it, attack it with a bow or an arrow or whatever, you can't really kill it because its heart is over there. It just gets up and walks away. So these hairy hearts, the whole families of them, were invading Ojibwe territory. And Geshishwash, this incredibly brave woman, taught the Anishinaabe how to kill them and set traps for them. And my friend Roger Roulette, with whom I have worked on many radio shows, who translates the Ojibwe and is a fantastic person. His aunt could tell Geshishwash stories for 2 weeks straight and not repeat herself. Geshishwash is a model for how to be a brave, smart person in a world full of people with magical powers. You don't have any, but you need to use your head to solve the problem. So these stories involve Geshishwash allowing the Wichiko to nibble on her arm, but not kill her because she's promising them that she's going to take them someplace interesting. And setting up a particular kind of teepee where there's a hole inside of it where the Wichiko step in and they step onto a mud slide and they slide to the bottom. And then you have to hit them with an axe exactly right to kill them, to really kill them. And then Geshishwash would also go and find their hearts and poke them with sticks and figure out whose heart they were poking because they could tell that person would faint or fall over or whatever, and then find the hearts and kill them. The stories are amazing, the Geshishwash stories. And they are the only stories I know of with a female heroine in them, actually. They're really cool. And when the Cree tell the story, the hero is an Anishinaabe guy who comes and tells them how to kill the Wichiko. In some of them, Geshishwash just humiliates the Wichikos, doesn't kill them, she pees on them from great height. Anyway, there's just, they're astonishing stories. And but that's like, the reason that humanity is okay is because Gejishwash and her ilk succeeded in eliminating Witigo as a regular thing. So now they just flit back and forth between the two worlds. They are not a real and present danger, but they were. These stories are about a time when it was a battle to make sure that the world was a safe place to live. I don't know if that helps you, but it's too bad Roger's Aunt Harriet has passed away. I collected about 3 stories from her, and I used them in a show about, I did a radio show about Mother Earth, which is kind of the opposite of the Witigo, because honestly, the Witigo stories are everywhere. The Mimigwese what explain half of the good things that happen in the world. But Mother Earth appears nowhere in any of these stories I've recorded in Ojibwe Cree. And so Roger Roulette, who I worked with, and Stan Catahan, who's Cree, who I worked with, they made me do that show about Mother Earth. And basically the idea is all the things I've just told you about Witigo and how essential they are to, and how revealing they are of Ojibwe thinking and Cree thinking, none of that is true about Mother Earth. It's a Christian imposition. And there's no stories that involve Mother Earth. There's no prayers that involve Mother Earth. There's no, none of the kind of myths that I've talked about does it ever appear. In this Manitoba and Saskatchewan Cree Ojibwe world. And so I'm delighted that you guys are interested in Witigo, because you are actually interested in something that is in fact important to Indigenous people and does allow you to enter into the way they think about the world. And I would just stay clear of Mother Earth, because it helps you do nothing but think about, like St. Francis of Assisi was praying to Mother Earth before the Franciscans ever got to North America. Leonardo da Vinci was mad about Mother Earth for a while, and he thought better of it. The Greeks invented it. It is an idea imposed on others by colonial adventurers. But the Witigo, you're on something there, because there truly is stories there. So I was going to explain up north, like in Louis' part of the world, the round of life would involve a summer fishing place, a fall hunting place, a winter trapping and hunting place. And then in the month of April, you have to get from where you're hunting to open water in the month of April. Not always easy to travel. And by then, you pretty well run out of food. And Louis said that April is a deadly month. And he said, so the thing you learn as an Indigenous person is that after you run out of food, you can walk for a week. Don't fall down. And so that notion of starvation being present all the time makes the Witigo story very, very real. And the idea that you must never give in to starvation is a kind of yearly practice. You mustn't. And it is about the strength of the person and the strength of their beliefs and their will to live, their desire to live, and the faith that they have in them to succeed. The farther south you get, the more people are a little bit more loose about it. And in southern Ojibwe country, like southern Manitoba, there are medicine men who in a dance will play the part of what they call Witigo Kan. So a Witigo is a real thing. Anything with Kan on it is like a Witigo. So Witigo Kan in a dance, somebody who dances the wrong direction, teases people, pinches stuff, like really just causes a certain amount of chaos within an otherwise very orderly ceremony, and everybody thinks it's hilarious and funny down here. Louis has no sense of humor about Witigo at all. It's a dangerous, deadly thing. It is the outcome of awful circumstances and something you don't want to have happen to anyone. But down south, it has become something, and just because they maybe don't have the same kind of extremity of choices and a much more resilient food supply, which they do. they have turned it into something where people are taught a lesson through the Witikokan. And I know people who are Witikokan ceremony, and they're nice people. And their role is serious, but not terrifying. It's I mean, in a way, like the Witigo stories, there are moral lessons in all of this, including the dance. You know, the person who is teased for doing something, they might have done that year. You know, they might need a reminder that that's not socially acceptable. But so you find like a range of attitude toward the notion of Witigo as a personal outcome, like as a risk to humanity. It changes quite a bit from north to south. I saw a question flash by, but I didn't have time to read it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, hopefully we have time for one more question. But yeah, so Becca asked, I've heard of these beings referred to as different names and been told that it's taboo, inappropriate to say that name out loud. What is the relationship of that word and the views around it to the stories you've been sharing today?
Okay, well, very good point. One of the things about Anishinaabe and Cree decorum is that you don't call somebody their name to their face. So there's an entire period in the summer where you wouldn't say, you talk about thunder. Or you would look out the window, make sure there's no clouds, then you would say it, but you wouldn't say it if there were clouds, or because it's rude. And so, for instance, when I work with these people, they call me my sister, my friend, my whatever. They don't name me to my face. It's just so if you don't want to provoke, you know, say the Thunderbirds is people are very strict about that. You don't say. You talk about there's euphemisms for everything. There's euphemisms like for like the Panache is actually a euphemism for what the real word for Thunderbird is. But I guess the thing is that if you have the right to talk about it, and you're discussing it as a kind of not in the context of a fate in someone's life, but in the context of an interpretive analysis, an analytic mode, like a then you probably do have the right to do it, and you won't suffer a bad thing. You're talking about it as something to be learned and something that needs to be talked about. So the stories the Witigo are named all the time, and they you know there is an element of that, like, but it's like if you're out in the bush, I wouldn't yell it out if I was you. But it's the same thing with thunder. I wouldn't do that. But it is, you're respecting other people's protocols in not doing that. But my experience with Indigenous people is that they'd rather talk about Witigo than listen to non-Indigenous people talk about stuff they're making up. And that they'd really rather start to talk about the things that do have bona fide Indigenous cultural meaning and import. And so I think I mean, your question's a really good one. And for your people, your friends who don't want to name it, you should go along with that. You should observe their protocols. But there's a phenomenon within Anishinaabe conversation. It's called respectful talk. And it's this use of euphemisms to refer to powerful things, or even to direct your attention away from the thing that matters most, and to not speak about the things that do matter the most. So again, I thank you for your question, because it's a very good one, and it means that you have actually kind of got to a point with somebody where they're willing to tell you, don't do that. And then, at some point, you might find out why. It really matters what the look on your face is when that's happening. And because I know that with Roger and Stan, who made me do the show about Mother Earth, they were heartily sick of Indigenous, non-Indigenous people talking about Mother Earth and thinking it had anything to do with them. And they wanted to redirect the conversation around to things that did actually allow them to talk about the sort of deeper philosophical side of Indigenous thought. And one of the really interesting things that is happening right now in Canada is that the Indigenous bands have been given the power to create new laws about Indigenous child and family. And so that people are turning to language and to these ideas about, respectful relationships, and like, for instance, if a person is born and in their early life becomes an orphan, they're automatically gifted. You know for sure they have spirit power, medicine power that they will exercise in life because they survived and whoever else didn't. And so an orphan gets a huge amount of respect in those communities, whereas an orphan in non-Indigenous circles is only thought of in terms of deficits. No mom, no dad, no family, no hope, and so it's those, like, engaging at that level, that's really important. They are trying to engage at that level in the child and family laws that they're developing now. The other thing is if somebody dies, you would adopt another person to fill that person's role. You wouldn't leave that person's place unfilled. So somebody might have passed away and another person will be asked to fill in to become that person's child, to call that lady mom forever. And it's like that reconstruction of the social that is so important to them, that they're trying to develop in law, instead of thinking about deficits, instead of thinking about closure, whatever that is, to think, no, there is no closure, there's just the building of that recreation of that relationship in another way. And so bravo for you for asking that question. It's really important.
Yeah, no, yeah, it was a really good question, Beck, and I guess we're a bit past 9 now, but I thought I'd ask, if you had kind of any, final remarks or anything you wanted to add before we wrapped up.
Well, I just, as I say, I'm very, very happy to talk to you. And I am happy to talk to you because this is something that is actually really interesting to Indigenous people too, and something that they could tell you about. And you will find stories of different sorts all over the country, but for sure you will find them all over the country. And I think that it's just a great place to start. It's interesting because one of the things that Louis says toward the end of the documentary is that he has a hard time passing these stories on to his children because they're a little bit gruesome, They're quite awful, the idea of people eating people, and I didn't even talk about how the Wendigo kill people, or how you have to kill a Wendigo to make sure they stay dead. All of that is fearsome and awful. But you can listen to the documentary for that. But he said, they have such important moral lessons that you don't want to be put off by that. They tell you how to live, and that stories matter. So, I guess I would just say that if Louis could be here, he would tell you the same thing.
Yeah, no, that's great, and great final remarks. Yeah, I'm just looking at the chat now, and Yeah, no, Vex says, thank you so much for your in-depth response. And do you have people you would recommend talking to and reaching out to about this? If you have, you know, any
Yeah.
colleagues in this area too that you think?
So where are you guys at Trent, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so there's a new curator at the Canoe Museum, Laura Pierce, who is an anthropologist who actually knows Louis very well too. And I would encourage you to get in touch with her. She's formerly at the Pitt Rivers Museum and the Oxford Anthro Department. And the other person is, I was his external on this thesis. Very nice Irish guy. Anyway, he has a PhD and he looked at, and this is really interesting, he looked at Wetiko as kind of modern repurposing of the idea to explain suicide. And he looked at graphic novels about Wetiko morphing into trying to trick people into committing suicide, and how it was a battle against the Wetiko in that way. Now that this was a contemporary fight. Anyway, I will remember his name. And I apologize to him. I will remember his name, but his thesis was wonderful, and might really help you. He's a medical anthropologist at London at Western now, and so he's also somebody you might really enjoy talking to. And I think if you follow up on those, I will send you the Rob Brightman thing. Rob Brightman is also still about, and he's amazing to talk to. He's a former Vietnam vet who just came out of the army and went straight north until he plowed into the bush, Pucketawag, and he didn't come out for 5 years. And his books are incredibly detailed. So his big book is Grateful Prey, which is about the relationship between spirit entities and hunting. But yeah, so that could be interesting.